managed abortion, just so we're all working from the same working definition of self-managed abortion. I will then do some medication abortion 101. I'll talk about the narrative around self-managed abortion and how, the narrative that we had before Roe is quite different than the narrative now. And then we'll talk about criminalization. I'll be sharing resources. And then I will also briefly talk about ways to take action in your own community on your own terms. So without further ado, I'm going to dive in. I also will say, please feel free to put questions in the chat. Throughout, I will try to pause, but there's also a Q&A dedicated slide at the end. So as Kate mentioned, my name is Caitlin Blenny. I use she, her pronouns. I'm the Outreach and Culture Manager at Reproaction. And as mentioned, we're an organization that leads bold direct action to increase access to abortion. I think we're most proudly known for our opposition research work, as well as our direct action work, which we do a lot of. We're here to help you and support you in your activism. And so some of the things that we do and can provide support and resources around are self-managed abortion. So what we're doing here today, exposing fake anti-abortion clinics, also known as crisis pregnancy centers. We suspect that in this post-Roe landscape, fake clinics will be going after more of our taxpayer money. They'll be going after more federal grants. So really making sure that our communities are educated on them, and so we can stop that from happening. And of course, as I mentioned, we also do research, which is information that we share with trusted partners. So Kate did a fantastic job grounding us in this moment, so I won't spend too long here. I want to acknowledge it's been 3 weeks since the Supreme Court leak, which showed us the court plans on overturning Roe v. Wade and returning the question back to the states. We know that 22 states have trigger laws on the books, which will mean once the decision comes down, abortion will no longer be accessible in those states, or rather no longer legal. We know that abortion is not accessible in most of our communities. I also want to acknowledge that last week, Oklahoma, in response to the news from the Supreme Court, enacted an extreme abortion ban that bans abortion after fertilization. So essentially has banned abortion entirely. And this is the first state in the country to just like blatantly ignore Roe in light of the SCOTUS news. I want to hold space for all of these things. I know all of us are feeling a lot of grief right now, but also ground us in the fact that we're all here because we know that our communities deserve better and that our communities are not getting what they need right now. We deserve to not only live, but to be able to thrive, and our current political moment isn't doing anything to support that. And so I wanted to take us to this map, and I imagine folks are joining from different places in the US. And so I think it really helps sometimes to think about how abortion access will fall and the impact it will have. So this map is from Guttmacher Institute. You can also go to states.guttmacher.org, and it's an interactive map. So I encourage you to play around with that. But what we see on this map here are blue states are where abortion will remain legal. And red states are states that will ban. And so what we see essentially is through the Southeast, a very large swath of states that will lose immediate access, as well as in the upper Midwest and just Midwest generally. And this can really help us start to think about the fallout that this will have on our communities, and to sort of help understand a little bit better what will happen once this decision comes down. I think a good place to look is what happened in Texas following the implementation of SB 8. For folks who don't know, SB 8 went into effect last September in 2021, and it banned abortion after 6 weeks. The reason why that ban has been able to withhold legal challenges is because it has a unique enforcement clause where it's not the state enforcing it, it's instead citizens suing anyone citizens who are given the ability to sue anybody who aids and abets with an abortion for up to $10,000. And so what this has essentially done is caused a lot of fear among providers as well as advocates. And there was also a huge fallout in the number of people who were able to actually access care in Texas. And so after 6 months, which is what this graph is showing here, we see that abortions in Texas fell by 50%, and that people were being forced to drive distances 14 times greater than before. But within this, I think we often talk about abortion within the clinical setting, and something that we saw emerge from the fallout of Texas's SB 8 is that, yes, many people were forced to travel out of state and did so with the support of abortion funds and other advocates, but we also saw a large increase in the demand for abortion pills. And so that brings us to our conversation on self-managed abortion. This is why we're talking about this in this moment. And I'm going to talk more about abortion pills in a second, but I wanted to give us an overview of what self-managed abortion is. So self-managed abortion is a broad term that includes any method someone may use to end a pregnancy. So that might be medication, it might be herbs, it might be manual aspiration. Some methods are more effective than others, though it's very important that when we're talking about this, that we emphasize no method should be criminalized. I always like to start here because I think sometimes we talk a lot about abortion without getting very specific. And so typically when we think about abortion, there's two primary types of care. So in-clinic abortion care includes things like vacuum aspiration or D&Es, also known as dilation and extraction. The in-clinic abortion care methods I want to point out are also used often in miscarriage management. So that's just a handy piece of repro health news to keep in your back pocket. In-clinic abortion care is also sometimes known as surgical care. I'm not the biggest fan of that descriptor because I think it can sound more intensive than what it actually is. And then the other thing is abortion pills. So this is actually now the more prominent method used in the US. I believe it was last year, 54% of abortions that happened in the US were done through abortion pills, medication abortions. And so this is there's two primary methods with medication abortion. So there's a combination of Mifepristone and Misoprostol, which are used together, and that is typically the in-clinic medication abortion regimen. And then there's also a way to self-manage an abortion using just Misoprostol. And so often when we're talking about self-managed abortion, the question that we get asked most often is like, why would someone self-manage an abortion? And I think this political moment lends itself as to the reason why people are given less opportunities, less options. And with less options, people are looking outside the healthcare system. But I also want to push back on the narrative that self-managed abortion is like the last resort or last option for somebody. And sometimes there are two things that primarily happen with self-managed abortion. There are things that pull someone towards self-managed abortion, and then there are things that push people towards self-managed abortion. The things that push people towards self-managed abortion are the things that are typically associated as barriers to abortion care. So that might be many of the things we're going to list here. So cost, distance to a clinic, transportation, lodging, in particular, if somebody has to travel to a state where there's a waiting period and they have to do multiple appointments, they either have to drive a very long distance or stay overnight someplace. We also know language barriers are an issue, age. So if someone is under 18 and they live in a state that has parental consent or parental notification laws, they may have to look for options outside of in-clinic care to feel safe, to be safe. Also access to childcare, anti-abortion protesters. That's one of those things I think that surprises a lot of people, but plays out a lot in small communities where, You might be afraid that someone you know from your church or someone that your parents know is going to be outside the clinic. Or worse, we know that the anti-abortion movement loves live streaming and photographing patients outside of clinics. And if somebody thinks that they're going to be criminalized or get in trouble for seeking that abortion, perhaps they're traveling out of state, that can make it really scary and can be a huge barrier to actually accessing care. Appointment availability. So this is something we've seen a lot in the fallout since Texas's SB 8. So people who would typically wait about a week for an appointment are now being forced to wait 2 to 3 weeks to get a clinical appointment. And we know that the longer somebody is pregnant, the more expensive the abortion care becomes. So it's an easy way to get stuck, or an easy way to get delayed care, because then you have to fundraise more money, find more money to get the care that you want. Insurance coverage bans continue to be an issue, primarily the Hyde Amendment, which bars Medicaid dollars from being used for abortion. Getting time off from school or work, laws and policy, which is most of what we are grappling with now on top of all of these other things. Stigma, the inability to find gender-affirming care, and distrust of the medical institution. Should I pause for questions? Maybe?
Sure. Do folks have questions? You do have the ability to unmute, or looking in the chat, I'm just seeing a conversation about the use of the word surgical for an in-clinic procedure and just how that feels really misleading. And CPCs are mentioned as another sort of barrier to care. The crisis pregnancy centers are anti-abortion centers.
Yes, absolutely. I'm so glad that that was uplifted. Yes, fake clinics literally exist to delay people or prevent people from getting the care that they want and need. And we're likely going to see more of that in this post-Roe landscape as well. So continuing on, and I'll pause again for questions, so no worries. To get into what the actual regimen is for self-managed abortion with pills, I mentioned that there are 2 methods. So this method, the method with Mifepristone and Misoprostol, is typically used in a clinical setting. When someone goes to an abortion clinic to get a medication abortion, they typically take the first tablet, which is Mifepristone. They take that in front, I have my little pins here. They take that in front of a provider, and then typically they go home with Misoprostol and insert it either orally under the tongue or vaginally. This process can also be done on somebody's own terms, on their own. So somebody can also use this regimen for self-managed abortion. And while I'm not going to go into depth of like the ins and outs of this, just because we don't have a ton of time to do that today, typically this method is about 97% effective. There's also another method for self-managed abortion, which is just with misoprostol. It looks like my title for this card got removed by mistake. That's okay. This method does not use mifepristone. And the reason for that is because before December 2021, the FDA had really tight restrictions on mifepristone. Essentially, it said that only a provider could have it. The person had to go in person, and there were all these other restrictions. A lot of those restrictions were lax during the pandemic, which opened the doors for tele-abortion care, which meant that people could chat with a provider virtually and get the pills either mailed to them or at a pharmacy. And then in December, that of course became permanent. The reason why we share the protocol for misoprostol only is because of the restrictions on mifepristone. It's believed that misoprostol is a little bit more accessible to get than mifepristone is. And that's because misoprostol has uses outside of abortion. Misoprostol is on the World Health Organization's list of essential medicines. It's also used to treat stomach ulcers, arthritis, dog arthritis. It's used in labor induction. has a variety of uses outside of abortion, which some advocates believe makes it a little bit more safe legally. So the process for this is a little different than the clinical regimen. So with the clinical regimen, the person takes the mifepristone, and then they usually have to wait a period of time, a couple hours, before they can take the misoprostol. With the misoprostol only regimen, essentially the person is going to need 12 tablets of misoprostol. So again, this varies a lot from the last one we saw, which was only 4 tablets. So with those 12 tablets, they're going to divide them up into 3 rounds. Each round will have four pills, and these are put under the tongue. The person lets them dissolve for 30 minutes. They'll wait 3 hours and then do that in the 3 rounds it takes to take all of the pills. Again, as I mentioned, we will not go into super depth with this today as much as I would love to. We are offering a training next week as well as one in June. If you're interested in learning the ins and outs of this protocol, I would be happy to train you. And so last thing I want to mention on this, of course, is you'll notice with this regimen that it specifically says under the tongue, and so does this one, even though I mentioned the pills can be inserted vaginally. And the reason for that, we're going to touch more on criminalization later on in this presentation, but the reason why we emphasize people use it under the tongue is to ensure that if the person needs medical attention, that upon an examination, there won't be any remnants of the pills left visibly. And so with either regimen, I wanted to set some expectations because I think often people don't know what to expect when they take abortion pills. And so once someone uses either regimen, if they are successfully having an abortion, they'll experience heavy, painful cramping. Sometimes this gets equated to like menstrual cramping. It's a little bit heavier than that. There will be considerable menstrual bleeding, which may also include passing large blood clots, nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, and depending on the person's body, possibly fevers and chills. Some other things to know, as I mentioned, we're not going in depth here, but I like to put this information out there because the more people who have access to it, the more people can share that information and help people. And so signs of a complication from a self-managed abortion can include heavy bleeding, abdominal pain, a fever, vaginal discharge. It's important to know that if somebody does need to seek medical care, that the complications for an abortion are the same as the complications for a miscarriage, and the person will be treated the same way. As we mentioned before, the in-clinic abortion care procedures are the same protocol for miscarriage management. To further support this idea that self-managed abortion is something that we should have access to, this comes from IBIS Reproductive Health, and it was a study they did in 2021, which found that 98.8% of people who used only misoprostol had successful abortions without surgical intervention. The study shows that self-managed abortion with pills and in-clinic abortion care have similar effectiveness rates when used before 9 weeks of pregnancy. I also want to add to that, I know that specifically says 9 weeks, and most clinics do medication abortions up to 10 weeks. This protocol can actually be used up to 12 weeks. So that's just another piece of knowledge to tuck away for later. And so a lot has changed since Roe happened in 1973. And so there are some things that I'd like to uplift as for us as advocates to start reframing and moving this conversation forward. So the first is that abortion pills are safe and effective. Self-managed abortion should never be equated to unsafe or dangerous or even harmful descriptors like do it yourself or back alley, stuff like that should really be avoided when we're talking about self-managed abortion with pills. We know that when people are given the tools and information they need, they're able to successfully end a pregnancy on their own outside of the medical institution. Further, self-managed abortion with pills is specifically an option that we didn't have 40 years ago. So while the risk before Roe was largely medical, that's not the moment we're at now because of the scientific and technological advancement of abortion pills. In addition, something that we hear quite often is like, what about in-clinic abortion care? And like, what about abortion providers? And like, we love abortion providers so much. And it's really important to push back on this narrative that self-managed abortion is against in-clinic abortion care. Ultimately, one option might just be better for somebody's life. In an ideal world, we would have access to both. So if somebody wants to go to a clinic and be with a provider and go through that process, that's great. They should be able to. In the same way that if somebody wants to self-manage an abortion at home on their own, or even with the support of a provider, those should also be options. It's really important to think of this as like an addition rather than something that's competing. And then, of course, as I mentioned before, the risks before Roe were largely medical. And it's not that abortion bans don't hurt people. People will be hurt. We know people are going to get hurt from these laws. But the risks today with self-managed abortion with pills are largely legal and not medical. So some quick do's and don'ts, because I know we have like such an awesome group of advocates with us this afternoon. So some things we want to avoid. We want to avoid using outdated imagery such as coat hangers, back alleys, when we're talking about these attacks on abortion access. There's a few reasons for that. The first of all, abortion is still legal for now in the US, and we don't want to make people think that they don't have options, but they actually do. But in addition to that, in this post-Roe landscape, it's really important for us to talk about the legal risks and the threat of criminalization, which does not need to exist. In that, it's also really important that we center those most impacted. I think there's this misconception that, Roe is going to fall and then we're going to see mass criminalization. And that is, I think, another narrative that we have to push against, because we know that criminalization has already been happening for decades in many communities. And typically the way it happens is through the singling out of certain groups of people. So we've seen over the last 20 years or so, at least 20 people have been prosecuted for self-managed abortion specifically, even though in most of the states where these proceedings and arrests are happening, there isn't a law that says you can't self-manage an abortion. In addition to that, also thinking through other groups that are uniquely at risk for criminalization. And also thinking about the way criminalization happens as more of an intersectional thing, that based on somebody's identity, it might not just be the incarceral system that they're up against. It might be other systems such as child welfare system, the immigration system, and so forth. We want to avoid creating a hierarchy between self-managed abortion and in-clinic abortion care. Again, self-managed abortion with pills expands the options for care, and everyone should be able to choose what type of care fits best for them and their life. And this brings us to a really important point. So I've been talking a lot about self-managed abortion, and I've touched a little bit on the law and focusing on the fact that, again, these risks are legal and not necessarily medical. And if you're going to take away anything from this presentation, I encourage you to take away this. It's really important that when we talk about self-managed abortion, we are providing information and not advice. Information about self-managed abortion belongs to all of us, and we are free to share information under our First Amendment free speech rights. Where it is not legal to talk about this is when someone is giving advice. So it's really important that when we talk about self-managed abortion, that we're careful about the way we do it. We want to avoid giving medical or legal advice. And you might be thinking, well, okay, what's the difference between what you were just talking about versus what's not okay? And the answer to that is perhaps a little silly and basic, but it's an important distinction to make. When we talk about self-managed abortion, we want to keep it to information and make sure that we're talking in third person. So instead of saying, you can go do this, instead saying somebody can take 12 tablets of misoprostol and follow this process. One's information, one's advice. Also, things to avoid, giving, again, advice to specific situations. So saying you should do this or you should do that, that then could become legal or medical advice. I will be sharing resources at the end of where actually people can get that legal and medical advice, and be with advocates who are well suited to do that. But I always like to really emphasize this. You should feel empowered to share this information. It's so important that we share this information, but we also have to do some work with harm reduction to ensure that we are doing this as safely as we can. So going into our conversation on criminalization, we know that the anti-abortion movement claims that they only want abortion providers to be punished, which I want to push that back and say providers should not be punished, they should be protected. It's really important that we keep that in mind as we move into this landscape. But a question that we started asking ourselves at Reproaction a few years ago is what happens if the law says that the provider is the one who's prosecuted for an abortion? What happens when the person is both the patient and the provider? When someone self-manages their abortion, they are both the person receiving care and the person administering care at the same time. And so it's really important as we move into this landscape to really, when anti-abortion leaders, politicians in our communities or states say that they don't want to prosecute people who self-manage their abortions, to really challenge that and get specific about questions about self-managed abortion and what will happen when people self-manage. We know that to date, there have been at least 20 arrests of people who've ended their pregnancies outside of a medical setting. And we also know that criminalization is never an adequate response, either health-wise or just generally for a pregnancy outcome. We know the logical consequence of abortion bans, whether or not our opposition wants to admit it, is to send pregnant people, providers, and ultimately advocates for jail. Something that was really chilling for me. I mentioned at the beginning that I am also involved in abortion fund work. Seeing Texas representatives send legal threats to abortion funds in Texas a few months after Texas's SB 8, we know what the end goal is. They are not hiding it. It's just on us to try to stop it and minimize as much as possible. So some practical things to know. I'm going to share some stuff about just quick tips that are good to keep in mind, and things to just carry with you. So I've mentioned it before, but it's really important. The complications for self-managed abortion with pills can be treated with the same treatment as miscarriage. So if somebody goes to a provider that treats miscarriage, such as a hospital or perhaps a primary care, they should be able to help. Unless somebody specifically discloses that they used abortion pills, a medical provider will not know. If somebody does disclose to a provider that they took abortion pills, that can open up the risk of criminalization and arrest. And we have seen far too many times health providers being confused on mandatory reporting laws and thinking that they need to report people to police. And we're seeing, I think it's 36% of cases, I think that was the latest number, of people who have been arrested or interrogated for self-managed abortion were referred to police by healthcare providers. So if you are a healthcare provider or you have healthcare providers in your life, making sure that they actually understand what needs to be reported is going to be really important in this landscape. And these cases do not need to be reported to police. In addition, the person should know that there's no blood test that can detect the presence of misoprostol or mifepristone in the blood. So again, unless it's disclosed, a provider will not know. And of course, disclosing a self-managed abortion to a medical provider, police, or other state actors, so such as social workers, for people perhaps we've seen like substance abuse counselors report, folks that are sort of supporting people in state settings. And so some resources that I wanted to share, there's been a lot of great conversations happening around digital security. And if you're anything like me, you're like, oh, this is the last thing I want to do. I don't want to set up a VPN or Tor, or I don't even know what those words are. And as much as it's not fun to do this stuff, it's really important that we're beefing up our digital security now before it's too late. And so some things to keep in mind: the Digital Defense Fund has fantastic resources for advocates, both people who might be looking for abortion pills to be aware of their digital footprints and like sort of what is generated by getting abortion pills online, as well as just for advocates to really make sure that we're beefing up our security to make sure we can stay safe. And for those of us who might have access to patient information through abortion fund work and so forth, that we're also doing that in this moment. There's been a lot of great conversations over the last couple weeks about digital security. And so Digital Defense Fund has this awesome graphic. I'm not going to go through everything on this list here, but just again, thinking through what are the digital footprints that someone leaves behind when they are looking for abortion pills online or even looking for in-clinic abortion care. So for example, email receipts. There's been a lot of talk about period tracking apps. And that is because a few years ago, it came out that period trackers were sharing data. And so people were noticing when they stopped using their period apps that they would start getting ads for like baby cribs and like baby food. And it was like through this investigation that like it was found that these companies were selling our data. And so on the next slide, I do have an alternative to period tracking app for you, but we're going to keep going through this. And so just really thinking through when we're doing things, what are the things that are being generated, the receipts, the confirmations, as well as we know that our phones also capture a lot of data. And so something that we've seen in the last couple of weeks is data broker firms saying that they will stop sharing or collecting data for people who go to abortion clinics, and they won't share that with the state, which is awesome. We need to see more of that. But again, just really thinking broadly about our digital footprints. As I mentioned before, Yuki is an awesome period tracker app. They do not store any information. They do not keep any information. They also have like these great info guides on there about contraception, miscarriage, that is accurate and is nicely kept in a phone. And so with that, we're gonna go over to our taking action, and I'm glad I'm right on time here. We can keep cruising through. So if you're interested in taking action on self-managed abortion, one of the best places to start is to really get firm on your own values. So what are the values that you bring not only to your social justice work, but your work on abortion? Why is it that you're passionate about this? The more that we're able to connect our values to this issue, the easier it is for us to talk about it and then spread that information and bust stigma generally. So for example, if your value is autonomy, being able to say self-managed abortion should be an option because I believe people are able to determine what's best for them can be a really powerful call to not only people who perhaps are already in this movement, but for those who perhaps are supporters, but not necessarily involved in the activism of it. Part of the reason it's so important that we are doing this work to meet our communities where they are in this moment is because of the power of abortion stigma. And we know that stigma is so prevalent and so pervasive. And this is something our opposition has had a lot of luck in capitalizing on. And so really important to understand that reproductive stigma isn't just abortion, it's any pregnancy outcome that is viewed as adverse. So that might be pregnancy loss, infertility, surrogacy, IVF, or the decision to become a young parent at a young age. And we know that stigma compounds in these things, and busting stigma on one can often help people experiencing anything related to this be able to have space to talk about it and connect it to this larger issue of reproductive freedom and justice. And so, you know, as I mentioned, we have limited time today, so we won't be able to go through everything, but if you're interested in taking action on this in your community, a question that we've been asking ourselves a lot at Reproaction is, you know, imagining that whenever the Supreme Court releases their ruling, the newspaper that day will probably say abortion is now illegal in 22 or, depending on the paper, 26 states. How are people in our community going to respond to this? What is going to be the feeling? It's likely going to be fear. It's probably going to be anger. And in the fall of that, what type of information will people be looking for? And I really want you to think about this within the contexts of the spaces that you occupy. So, for example, if you're somebody that loves taking direct action, you love going to rallies and protests, what information can be shared there? Or let's say you're somebody that's not a rallier. Maybe you're somebody who goes to a book club every week. Maybe you can hand out a flyer at that book talk, or ask to talk for a few minutes about this, or even just identify yourself as a safe person to talk to. I think in this setting where the threat of criminalization will be so real for people, it's really important that we're meeting people where they're at and helping them plug into existing resources. I think as advocates, it's always frustrating when these things happen, when people are like, let's create our own groups and let's start an abortion fund. And in this moment as advocates, we really want to push people to plug into an existing resource. And if that doesn't exist, yes, build one. But again, to build on the infrastructure that's already being built right now. And so as promised, I wanted to share some support resources that are more practical that can be shared with people within your network. So the first is the Repro Legal Helpline, and this is a resource from If, When, How Lawyering for Reproductive Justice. The way this works is if somebody wants legal help related to a self-managed abortion, this is the place to go. They have information about knowing your rights in each state, which if you go through their website, they have tons of great resources there. The way the helpline works is it is a warm line. So somebody would call and then get a call back in 2 to 3 days. If it is an emergency, they do try to pick that up faster and get back to the person. There's also a secure form online to submit help claims. Although, as we mentioned before, with digital security, that does begin a paper trail. So just being aware of that. There's also other hotlines. So the Reprocare Hotline is staffed by pro-choice advocates who are available to talk to people before, during, or after a self-managed abortion or just abortion generally. And that's a phone line. It is a live line, so the person should just call and be able to have someone pick up on the other line to have that conversation. And then there's the M&A hotline, which is miscarriage and abortion hotline. And this is phone and text. They have a little bit of longer hours than the other one does, and that's staffed by physicians. There's also the Repro Legal Defense Fund. So this covers bail and helps people get legal representation if they are investigated, arrested, or prosecuted for self-managed abortion. I also got confirmation that this, if an advocate, let's say, gets criminalized for helping someone with a self-managed abortion, perhaps a doula or even just a friend, this resource is also available for them and can be accessed at their website, reprolegaldefense.com or .org. We touched on fake clinics a little bit. As I mentioned, it's suspected that they will be looking for more funding in this post-Roe landscape. And so it's really important for us to get ahead of this and go on offense and say, hell no, you're not getting more of our money. We don't want you to do this. And so Reproaction has a fake clinic database. You can put in your zip code or your city and it'll come up. Some things I want to uplift from this is there's this misconception that fake clinics are like mom and pop type things, or that they're like associated with like a small church. When in reality, the overwhelming majority, about 70%, are affiliated with larger anti-abortion fake clinic chains. And so those chains are CareNet, Heartbeat International, Birthright. There's a few others, but those tend to be the primary ones. And the other disturbing trend that we've seen increase a lot more, and something that we've adapted our website to include, is the opposition is pushing this idea of abortion pill reversal, which asserts with the medication abortion regimen we talked about before with the two different types of pills, it inserts this idea that after someone takes mifepristone, they can reverse the abortion by being injected with progesterone through the remainder of the trimester. This is not based in medical science. There is no medical or scientific backing to this. They tried to do a study a few years ago and actually had to stop because people were bleeding out. And so it's really important. This is unfortunately coming up in state legislatures. Really important for us to shut this down and not entertain these conversations. And then, of course, local abortion funds. I'm sure we're all familiar with these. These can help people fund their abortions and also navigate the specific state and local landscape. And then practical support networks. These are just two examples. But if you're interested in doing practical support, so that's giving drives, hosting people at your house, perhaps you have a spare bedroom. It's really important to connect with existing organizations, and the Apiary Collective, which is here on the left, is sort of a hub in that they provide resources and also know which ones exist. So if that's of interest, definitely check that out. And the Bridge Collective is one that's specific to Texas. There's also the Judicial Wiki. So as we mentioned, parental involvement or consent laws are pretty pervasive through the US. So if somebody is under 18 and needs to access an abortion, If When How has this wiki to help walk through the steps. I'm running low on time, so I'm gonna zoom past this, but Reproaction also has resources on our website. We have webinars, and then, as I mentioned, we're doing a training on the World Health Organization's protocol for self-managed abortion with misoprostol. So this is going in depth into the World Health Organization's protocol. If you're interested in that, we're doing a training on the 31st of May and June 18th, and you are welcome to come. Just feel free to shoot me an email. And then we have fact sheets. Again, these are on our website, reproaction.org/SMA. And with that, I'm happy to take any questions anyone might have.
Thanks, Kaylin. I want to lift up a question in the chat from Pam a little while back about if you have information about how much abortion pills that people access outside of clinics typically cost.
That is a great question. It may vary a little bit by state. So for example, I live in Virginia. We have teleabortion available to us in the state. And so through Aid Access, which is an online distributor, I could legally get abortion pills for about like $150. So it tends to be a lot cheaper than in-clinic medication abortion care, which is typically starts at like $450 and goes up from there. I've also seen pricing around $200 or $250, so it is several $100s cheaper than in-clinic care.
There's also a question about what happened to the folks you mentioned who have already been arrested or prosecuted for their pregnancy outcomes.
Yeah, that is a great question. I think every case is a little bit different, and a lot of the cases that we know about, we know because advocates were able to get involved and intervene. I shared the 20 number, but If When How actually released numbers this past week that puts that number at closer to 60. And that doesn't even include cases involving minors because of the way the courts for juvenile courts go. Why did I forget that word? And so in many cases, I'll also say, based on my experience, we did a campaign in Wisconsin where people were being criminalized for substance use in pregnancy. Often they didn't realize they were pregnant and they were being arrested and prosecuted. And what we found there, the numbers were so atrocious. And people were just sitting in prisons because they couldn't make bail and they were just awaiting sentencing. And so I don't really have a great answer for that. It's kind of the wild, wild west right now. Yeah.
And I shared in the chat a link to the National Advocates for Pregnant Women. They are a legal advocacy organization and get involved in a lot of these cases where people are prosecuted for whether it's experiencing a stillbirth or self-managing one's abortion or using substances while pregnant, all of those things. So I dropped that in the chat. And I just also want to lift up that I'm going to be sending y'all a packet of a bunch of resources related to this presentation. So you'll have more opportunities to catch that. Sarah says, going back to what you were saying about outdated language and imagery, there's been talk about the use of Handmaid's Tale clothing at rallies and hearing that this is no longer effective. Do you want to share anything about that, Caitlin?
Yeah, that is a great question, and thank you for checking in on that. I think the reason why handmaidens imagery has been pushed back against is because it pushes this idea that criminalization isn't happening in our communities already. It, I think, sets expectations for what will happen with criminalization that aren't rooted in the reality of the systems that we have in the US, which are deeply rooted in white supremacy. And the Handmaid's Tale, the imagery specifically, I think people feel is a little whitewashed and sensational, and I welcome other ideas of that, but that tends to be the gist.
Yes. Seeing Kenyatta share in the chat that those handmade clothes and costumes really ignore the realities that Black and Brown people have already been living in for generations in America. And that's really, I think, like a lot of the basis of the critique is that Margaret Atwood is a white writer who created The Handmaid's Tale and really took a lot of examples of things that had really have and continue to really happen in terms of reproductive control to Black and Brown folks, and then put a white face on it. So we want to be, I think we want to always be cognizant of history, and that reproductive control and coercion are huge, and eugenics are like really deeply rooted in our country's history, right? Abortion is not politicized just around individuals and individual choices. The control of reproduction is used to control whole communities. So we are about at 2:00. I want to, thank you, Caitlin, for this really good presentation and for sharing so many resources. I want to reassure folks that we are going to share those out. And I also want to remind people that we are hosting the final of this community care series. That session is happening on June 8th. at 6 p.m. Eastern time. I'm putting the registration link in the chat, and that is focused on, it's called You Are Not Alone, supporting communities through pregnancy experiences. And we're bringing together folks to talk about how do we support people on an emotional peer level in our communities who are seeking abortions, making decisions about pregnancy, and trying to navigate this likely post-Roe landscape that we're moving into increasingly. So join us for that, and be sure to check out Reproaction. And yeah, just thank you so much, Caitlin, for being here with us.
Thank you. And thank you all for coming. It was such a pleasure.